Body cavity. A body cavity is any space or compartment or potential space in an animal body. Cavities accommodate organs and other structure. Cavities as potential spaces contain fluid. The largest human body cavity are the ventral body cavity and the dorsal body cavity. In the dorsal body cavity, the brain and the spinal cord are located. The membranes that surround the central nervous system, organs, the brain, and the spinal cord in the cranial and spinal cavities are the three meanings. The differentiately spaces contain different types of fluid. In the meanings, for example, the fluid is cerebrospinal fluid in the abdominal cavity. The fluid contained in the peritoneum is a serous fluid. In amatones and some invertebrates, the peritoneum lines their largest body cavity called the column. The dorsal posterior cavity and the ventral anterior cavity are the largest body compartments. The dorsal body cavity includes the cranial cavity enclosed by the skull and contains the brain, and the spinal cavity enclosed by the spine and contains the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity includes the thoracic cavity enclosed by the rib cage and contains the lungs and heart, and the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdomen-pelvic cavity can be divided into the abdominal cavity enclosed by the rib cage and pelvis and contains the kidneys, uterus, stomach, intestines, livers, gallbladder, and pancreas, and the pelvic cavity enclosed by the pelvis and contains bladder, anus, and reproductive system. Ventral cavity is the ventral cavity has two main subdivisions, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is the more superior subdivision of the ventral cavity and is enclosed by the rib cage. The thoracic cavity contains the lungs surrounded by the pleural cavity and the heart surrounded by the pericardial cavity located in the mediastinum. The diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity and separates its forms the more inferior abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity is the largest cavity in the body, occupying the entire lower half of the trunk. Although no membrane physically divides the abdominopelvic cavity, it can be useful to distinguish between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity occupies the entire lower half of the trunk anterior to the spine and houses the organs of digestion. Just under the abdominal cavity, the anterior to the bus stop is the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is finny-shaped and is located inferior and anterior to the abdominal cavity and the organs of the production. Dorsal body cavity. The dorsal body cavity contains the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity is a large bean-shaped cavity filling most of the upper skull where the brain is located. The spinal cavity is the very narrow, thread-like cavity running from the cranial cavity down the entire length of the spinal cord. In dorsal cavity, the cranial cavity houses the brain and the spinal cavity encloses the spinal cord. Just as the brain and spinal cord make up a continuous uninterrupted structure, the cranial and spinal cavities that house them are also continuous. The brain and spinal cord are protected by the bones of the skull and vertebral column and by cerebrospinal fluid, a colorless fluid produced by the brain which cushions the brain and spinal cord within the body dorsal body cavity function. These cavities contain and protect delicate internal organs, and the ventral cavity allows for significant changes in the size and shape of the organ as they perform their function. Anatomical structure are often described in terms of cavity in which they reside. The body maintains its internal organization by means of membranes, sheaths, and other structure that separate compartments, the lung, heart, stomach, and intestine. For example, can expand and contract without destroying other tissues or disrupting the activity of nearby organs. The ventral cavity includes the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity and subdivisions. The dorsal cavity includes the cranial and spinal cavities. Thank you.